There's something profoundly unsettling about the way a cat stares at you. Those unblinking eyes seem to hold secrets from another time, another world. Perhaps that's because, in a very real sense, they do. The domestic cat lounging on your sofa carries within it the genetic memory of a civilization where its ancestors weren't merely pets or companions, but living gods who walked among mortals with impunity. In ancient Egypt, for over 3,000 years, cats held a power that no human monarch, no matter how absolute, could ever truly claim. They ruled not through armies or decrees, but through something far more enduring. They ruled through silence, through mystery, through the sacred space between the mortal and divine. This isn't a story about how Egyptians worshipped cats, though they certainly did. This is a story about how cats fundamentally shaped one of history's greatest civilizations without uttering a single meow of command. How they influenced law, economy, religion, art, warfare, and daily life so thoroughly that their presence became woven into the very fabric of Egyptian existence. How they achieved what countless human rulers have attempted and failed to do throughout history. They made themselves absolutely indispensable while remaining utterly independent. To understand the profound relationship between ancient Egypt and cats, we need to journey back more than 6,000 years to a time when the Nile Delta was becoming the cradle of one of humanity's most remarkable civilizations. We need to see how a wild desert predator and an agricultural society found in each other something neither could have anticipated. Not just utility, but reverence. Not just companionship, but divinity itself. Long before the Great Pyramids pierced the Egyptian sky, long before pharaohs claimed dominion over the two lands, a small wildcat prowled the rocky outcrops and scrublands of North Africa. The African wildcat, known to modern science as Felis libica, was a solitary hunter perfectly adapted to the harsh desert environment. Slightly larger than today's house cat, with sandy fur striped and spotted to blend seamlessly with sun-baked stones and dried grasses, these cats were consummate survivors. They hunted rodents, birds, small reptiles, anything they could catch with their lightning reflexes and razor-sharp claws. These wildcats had no interest in humans. Why would they? Humans were noisy, unpredictable, and offered nothing that a skilled hunter couldn't obtain for itself. But then something changed. Around 10,000 years ago, humans in the Fertile Crescent, that sweeping arc of land from the Nile through Mesopotamia, made a discovery that would alter the course of history: agriculture. They learned to cultivate grain, to store it in large quantities, to build permanent settlements around these precious food stores, and with the grain came the mice, and the rats, and all manner of small creatures that saw in these human granaries an endless buffet. The humans tried everything to protect their stores. They built better containers, elevated their storage facilities, set traps. Nothing worked particularly well, but the wildcats noticed. These felines, ever opportunistic, discovered that human settlements offered something remarkable, a concentration of prey unlike anything in the natural world. Why spend energy hunting across vast territories when humans had helpfully gathered all the mice in one convenient location? This is where the story becomes fascinating. Unlike dogs, which humans actively bred and trained for specific purposes, cats essentially domesticated themselves. They made the decision to move closer to human settlements. The boldest cats, the ones with slightly lower fear responses to humans, were the most successful at exploiting this new food source. Over generations, natural selection favoured cats that could tolerate human presence. These cats thrived, had more offspring, and slowly, without any human intervention, a population of cats emerged that was genetically distinct from their wild cousins. The earliest concrete evidence of this process in Egypt comes from a cemetery at Hierakonpolis, one of the most important pre-dynastic Egyptian sites. In a tomb dating back nearly 6,000 years, archaeologists discovered the remains of 6 cats, a male, a female, and 4 kittens. What's remarkable about this find is that these cats show signs of having been cared for by humans. Their bones indicate they were well fed, and their burial in a human cemetery suggests they held some significance to the community. But were they truly domesticated at this point? The evidence suggests something more complex. Analysis of the skeletal remains shows healed fractures in some of the bones, injuries that would have required weeks of care and immobility to heal. Wildcats don't typically survive such injuries, and if they do, they certainly don't stay near humans during their vulnerable recovery period. These cats must have been kept in some form of captivity, fed and protected until they healed. This speaks to a relationship that went beyond mere tolerance. Humans were investing resources, time and care into these animals. Yet the archaeological record shows us that full domestication was a slow process in Egypt. During the pre-dynastic period and early dynastic period, spanning from roughly 5000 BCE to 2700 BCE, cats appear rarely in Egyptian art and archaeology. They were present certainly, but they hadn't yet achieved the exalted status they would later hold. The Egyptians of this era were still experimenting with which animals to bring into their society. They kept many creatures in captivity, including some that would never become domesticated: hyenas, baboons, even gazelles. What set cats apart was their perfect alignment with Egyptian needs. Egypt's wealth was built on grain. The annual flooding of the Nile deposited rich silt on the riverbanks, creating ideal conditions for growing wheat and barley. But storing this grain was a constant battle against rodents and snakes. Rats could devastate a grain store in weeks. Snakes, particularly cobras, were deadly threats to farmers and villagers. Egypt needed a solution, and cats provided it with an efficiency that bordered on miraculous. A single cat can kill thousands of mice and rats over its lifetime. Cats hunt snakes with remarkable fearlessness, their quick reflexes allowing them to avoid venomous strikes while delivering lethal blows. Even the presence of a cat's scent can deter rodents from approaching an area. But perhaps most importantly, cats didn't require the kind of active management that other domestic animals demanded. You didn't need to train a cat to hunt rodents. It did so instinctively, often seeming to do it for the sheer pleasure of the hunt rather than just for food. By the Middle Kingdom, roughly 2000 BCE, cats had become fully integrated into Egyptian society. Tomb paintings from this era show cats sitting beneath chairs during banquets, wearing decorative collars, accompanying their owners on hunting expeditions in the marshes. The transformation was complete. These were no longer wild cats tolerating human proximity. These were domestic cats living in Egyptian homes. But something else was happening simultaneously, something that would elevate cats far beyond mere useful animals. The Egyptians were beginning to see in cats something divine. The same qualities that made cats effective hunters, their grace, their apparent fearlessness, their mysterious independence, these were the qualities the Egyptians associated with their gods. And slowly, deliberately, cats began to occupy a space in Egyptian religion that no other animal would match. The archaeological evidence shows this transformation clearly. Cat-shaped amulets appear in the archaeological record around 2100 BCE, during the 11th dynasty. These weren't depictions of wild felines or abstract symbols. These were clearly domestic cats, recognizable ancestors of the cats the Egyptians kept in their homes. The fact that people wore these amulets suggests cats were already being invested with protective, possibly divine qualities. By the time we reach the New Kingdom, around 1550 BCE, cats were everywhere in Egyptian art and culture. They appear in tomb paintings, in sculpture, in religious texts. Most tellingly, they appear in increasingly intimate and affectionate contexts. We see paintings of cats eating fish under dining tables, of cats caring for kittens, of cats being held and petted by their owners. These images tell us that the human-cat relationship had evolved into something deeply emotional, something that went far beyond utility. Recent DNA studies have added fascinating layers to this story. In 2017, an international team of researchers analysed the DNA of more than 200 ancient cats from archaeological sites across Europe, the Middle East and Africa. What they found challenges some earlier assumptions about cat domestication. While the initial domestication of cats likely began in the Near East around 10,000 years ago, Egyptian cats represented a second, possibly independent wave of domestication. The DNA signature of Egyptian cats shows they descended from the North African lineage of the African wildcat, and this Egyptian lineage is what ultimately spread across the world. This makes sense when you consider Egypt's unique position in the ancient world. Egypt wasn't just powerful, it was the ancient world's preeminent trading civilization. Egyptian grain fed much of the Mediterranean. Egyptian goods, from papyrus to perfumes, from gold to glassware, flowed along trade routes that stretched from sub-Saharan Africa to Mesopotamia, from the Greek islands to the Arabian Peninsula, and with Egyptian goods travelled Egyptian cats. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Before cats could conquer the world, they first had to conquer Egypt, and that conquest, though bloodless, was absolute. Religion in ancient Egypt wasn't a separate sphere of life, it was life. Every aspect of Egyptian existence, from agriculture to astronomy, from medicine to mathematics, was viewed through a religious lens. The Egyptians saw their world as saturated with divine presence. The Nile flooded because the gods willed it. The sun crossed the sky because Ra sailed his celestial bark. Death wasn't an ending but a transformation, a journey to another realm. And the gods didn't exist in some distant heaven. They were present, active, involved in daily life. Many Egyptian gods could take animal forms or were depicted with animal heads on human bodies. This wasn't because the Egyptians believed gods were literally animals. Rather, they understood that certain animals embodied divine qualities so perfectly that they served as the best representations of particular gods' nature and power. The ibis embodied wisdom, so Thoth, god of knowledge, took the ibis's form. The crocodile embodied primal power and the dangers of the Nile, so Sobek appeared as a crocodile. And the cat? Well, the cat embodied something the Egyptians found both comforting and terrifying: protective ferocity. The first feline deity in Egyptian religion was Mafdet, whose worship dates back to the First Dynasty, around 3100 BCE. Mafdet was depicted with the head of a cat, or sometimes a leopard or cheetah, and she served a specific crucial function. She protected the pharaoh from snakes and scorpions. In a land where venomous creatures were a constant threat, this was no small matter. Tomb inscriptions from this early period call Mafdet the one who slays serpents. The choice of a feline for this role made perfect sense. Anyone who has watched a cat dispatch a snake understands why the Egyptians associated felines with protection against reptilian threats. But Mafdet, while important, never achieved the widespread popularity of the goddess who would become the ultimate embodiment of feline divinity, Bastet. The story of Bastet's evolution is, in many ways, the story of how Egyptian civilization changed over 3 millennia. When Bastet first appears in the archaeological record during the Second Dynasty, around 2090 BCE, she is depicted as a fierce lioness. She is a warrior goddess, a protector of the pharaoh, a divine force of terrifying power. In her early form, Bastet is virtually indistinguishable from Sekhmet, another lioness goddess associated with warfare and destruction. The Egyptians had a complex relationship with lions. These great cats were both admired and feared. They embodied solar power, ferocity, and royal authority. Many pharaohs kept lions as symbols of their might, and lion imagery saturated royal iconography. But lions were also dangerous, unpredictable, and increasingly rare in Egypt as hunting and habitat loss reduced their numbers. By contrast, domestic cats were everywhere, living in close proximity to humans while retaining much of the grace and mystery of their larger cousins. Sometime during the Third Intermediate Period, roughly between 170 and 1664 BCE, Bastet began to transform. The lioness became a cat. This transformation coincided with dramatic changes in Egyptian society. The great warrior pharaohs of the New Kingdom had given way to a more divided, complex political landscape. Egypt faced internal struggles and external threats. The unifying power of centralized authority had weakened, and regional cults gained importance. Bubastis, the delta city that was Bastet's cult centre, rose in prominence. Bastet as a cat goddess represented something fundamentally different from Bastet as a lioness. She retained her protective qualities, but now she embodied domestic protection, the safety of the home, the nurturing of children. She became associated with fertility, with joy, with music and dance. She was still capable of fierce wrath if provoked, retaining that essential feline duality, but her primary aspect was now gentle, approachable, loving. This was a goddess you could invite into your home quite literally by keeping a cat. The transformation of Bastet's image reflects the Egyptians' evolving understanding of domestic cats. Living with these animals day after day, year after year, across generations, the Egyptians observed their nature with remarkable attention. They saw how cats could be simultaneously gentle with kittens and ruthless with prey, how they could purr contentedly on a lap one moment and transform into lightning-fast hunters the next, how they demanded respect and offered affection, but always on their own terms. These observations informed how Bastet was understood and worshipped. Bastet's iconography is rich with meaning. She's often depicted holding a sistrum, a musical instrument used in religious ceremonies. The sistrum was specifically associated with pacifying fierce goddesses, literally calming them, with music. This detail emphasizes Bastet's dual nature. She is fierce but can be soothed, powerful but approachable. She frequently carries an ankh, the symbol of life, reinforcing her association with fertility and protection. In many statues, she's accompanied by kittens, emphasizing her maternal aspect. One particularly beautiful piece of religious poetry from the late period describes Bastet's nature. Sweet of love, mistress of joy, lady of all the gods, beautiful of face, kindly of glance, lovely of visage, Bastet, the great lady of Ankhtawi, mistress of enjoyment, perfect one, beloved of all the gods. This is a goddess of pleasure, of life's gentler joys. But the texts also warn that to harm what Bastet protects is to invite her terrible wrath. She is the archetypal mother, nurturing her young but deadly to any threat. Bastet wasn't the only feline deity in the Egyptian pantheon, though she was certainly the most important. Sekhmet, the lioness goddess, retained her own powerful cult. While Bastet and Sekhmet were sometimes described as two aspects of the same divine force, the protective solar feminine, they had distinct personalities and functions. Sekhmet was invoked in times of war, plague and danger. Bastet was invoked for domestic harmony, successful childbirth and daily protection. The goddess Mut, consort of Amun, was sometimes depicted as a cat or with a cat as her sacred animal. Tefnut, the goddess of moisture, could take feline form. Even Ra himself, the supreme solar deity, was described in some texts as taking the form of a great cat to battle the chaos serpent Apep. The 17th chapter of the Book of the Dead contains a famous passage. I am the cat who fought hard by the Persea tree in Heliopolis, on the night when the foes of Osiris were destroyed. This wasn't just any cat. This was Mao, the great cat, Ra himself in feline form, defender of cosmic order against primordial chaos. This multiplicity of feline deities speaks to how thoroughly cats had penetrated Egyptian religious consciousness. Different gods might take cat form at different times for different purposes, but all of them drew on the same fundamental association. Cats represented divine power that was simultaneously protective and dangerous, nurturing and fierce, gentle and deadly. The theological implications were profound. If gods could manifest as cats, and cats were the living representatives of these gods, then every cat was potentially divine. Not metaphorically divine, actually divine. The cat sleeping by your hearth might be Bastet herself watching over your family. The cat hunting rats in your granary might be Ra, maintaining order against chaos. This belief fundamentally shaped how Egyptians interacted with cats. In the Book of the Dead, cats appear in scenes of judgment and protection. The great cat sits beneath the persea tree, eternally vigilant. This image emphasized the cat's role as a guardian, not just of physical spaces, but of spiritual realms. The persea tree itself was sacred, representing protection and eternal life. That a cat guarded it underscored feline importance in the cosmic order. Bubastis, modern Tel Basta, near Zagazig, became the most important centre of cat worship. The city's very name means House of Bastet. During the 22nd dynasty, which ruled from roughly 945 to 715 BCE, Bubastis was at its peak. The pharaohs of this dynasty made Bastet city a royal residence and poured resources into her temple. Archaeological excavations have revealed a temple complex of stunning scale and beauty, with granite columns, intricate reliefs, and a sacred lake surrounding the central sanctuary on three sides. Herodotus, the Greek historian who visited Egypt in the 5th century BCE, described Bastet's temple at Bubastis as the most delightful in all of Egypt. He wrote that while other temples might be larger or more expensive, none pleased the eye quite like Bastet's shrine. It stood on an island formed by canals that branched off from the Nile, with tree-lined walkways leading to the entrance. Inside, a towering statue of Bastet dominated the main hall, carved from black granite or basalt, her cat head crowned with the solar disk. The temple wasn't just a place of worship. It was an economic powerhouse, a pilgrimage destination, and essentially a massive cat sanctuary. Thousands of cats lived in and around the temple complex, cared for by priests and temple staff. These cats weren't wild strays, they were sacred animals, carefully tended and, as we'll see, eventually mummified and buried with elaborate ceremony. The worship of Bastet and other feline deities created a religious feedback loop. The more divine significance cats gained, the more carefully people observed them, and the more they observed them, the more divine qualities they discovered. A cat's ability to see in near darkness was seen as a divine gift, linking them to the sun god who navigated the darkness of the underworld each night. A cat's fastidious grooming was seen as ritual purity. A cat's apparent aloofness was interpreted as divine dignity, the natural demeanour of a being that existed simultaneously in the mortal and divine realms. This divine status had very real, very practical consequences. It meant that cats were protected, venerated, and integrated into Egyptian society at every level. But it also meant that elaborate religious practices developed around them, practices that would eventually create one of the ancient world's most bizarre and profitable industries. Imagine for a moment that you're living in Thebes during the New Kingdom, around 400 BCE. Your home is a modest mud brick structure near the river, with a small courtyard and several rooms that stay relatively cool even in the blazing summer heat. You're a scribe, employed in the administration of a local temple, which means you're not wealthy but comfortably middle class by Egyptian standards. And in your home, curled in a patch of sunlight streaming through a high window, lies a small tabby cat. This cat is not your pet in the modern sense, though you feed it scraps of fish and dried meat, and your children delight in dangling papyrus strips for it to chase. This cat is a member of your household with its own standing, its own rights, its own sacred nature. When it purrs, you feel genuinely blessed. When it brings you a dead mouse, you accept it as an offering from a divine being. When it scratches your son for pulling its tail, you scold your son, not the cat. Because the cat might be Bastet herself, and even if it's not, it certainly carries her essence. This was the reality of living with cats in ancient Egypt. Every interaction was coloured by the understanding that these animals were not merely useful or entertaining, but fundamentally sacred. This belief pervaded every social class. Archaeological evidence shows that both wealthy nobles and humble farmers kept cats. The difference was merely in how much luxury they could afford to lavish on them. In the homes of the wealthy, cats lived like royalty. They wore collars made of precious metals, sometimes studded with semi-precious stones. They ate from their owners' plates, sharing meals of fish, fowl, and choice cuts of meat. When they died, they were mourned extravagantly and mummified with elaborate ceremony. But even in poorer households, cats were treated with respect and care. Everyone understood that mistreating a cat was not just cruel, it was sacrilegious. The legal protections afforded to cats in ancient Egypt were extraordinary, and they tell us more clearly than any religious text how thoroughly feline sanctity had become embedded in Egyptian law and custom. Diodorus Siculus, a Greek historian who wrote in the 1st century BCE, provided one of the most vivid accounts of Egyptian cat law. He recorded that killing a cat, whether deliberately or accidentally, was punishable by death. This wasn't just a theoretical law. Diodorus recounted an incident that he witnessed personally. A Roman soldier, part of a diplomatic or military delegation, accidentally killed a cat. Despite the diplomatic implications, despite the fact that Rome was the most powerful force in the Mediterranean at that time, despite the personal intervention of the pharaoh himself trying to prevent an international incident, an enraged mob of Egyptians lynched the unfortunate Roman. This account has sometimes been dismissed as exaggeration, the kind of exotic tale that ancient writers loved to tell about foreign lands. But other evidence supports it. Legal papyri from various periods reference the special status of cats. Temple records document compensation paid to families for lost cats. Archaeological evidence of careful cat burials, even of cats with no obvious connection to wealthy families, suggests that feline deaths were taken seriously at all social levels. The law went beyond just protecting cats from harm. It was illegal to export cats from Egypt. The Egyptian government apparently maintained an entire bureaucracy dedicated to preventing cat smuggling and, when necessary, recovering Egyptian cats from foreign lands. This might sound absurd until you consider the economic and cultural implications. Cats were economically valuable for pest control, especially in a grain-based economy. They were culturally significant as sacred animals, and they gave Egypt something no other civilization had: a monopoly on domestic cats. Of course, prohibition rarely works perfectly, and a black market in Egyptian cats inevitably emerged. Phoenician traders, Greeks, Romans, all manner of foreign merchants attempted to smuggle cats out of Egypt. Egyptian authorities apparently took this seriously enough to send official missions to neighbouring countries to recover stolen cats. Whether these missions were diplomatic or more coercive is unclear from the historical record, but the very fact they existed tells us how seriously Egypt took its feline population. The most famous story involving cats and Egyptian law is the Battle of Pelusium in 525 BCE. According to the ancient writer Polyaenus, the Persian king Cambyses II, knowing full well the Egyptians' religious reverence for cats, ordered his soldiers to carry cats, or paint cats on their shields, or use images of cats depending on which version of the story you credit, as they advanced on the Egyptian army. The Egyptians, faced with the choice between defending their city and risking harm to sacred cats, chose not to fight. Pelusium fell, and with it, Egyptian independence. Is this story literally true? Probably not in all its details. Ancient writers loved dramatic irony, and the image of mighty Egypt brought low by its love of cats makes for compelling narrative. But like many ancient stories, it likely contains a kernel of truth. The Persians certainly knew about Egyptian cat worship. They almost certainly used this knowledge strategically, and Egyptian soldiers may well have hesitated to fight under circumstances where cats might be harmed. At minimum, the story tells us how Egyptian cat worship was perceived by the outside world, as genuine, deeply held, and potentially exploitable. When a cat died in an Egyptian household, the mourning was formalized in public. family members shaved their eyebrows as a sign of grief. This wasn't a choice or a gesture, it was an expected practice, documented in both ancient texts and contemporary observations by foreign visitors. The shaving of eyebrows served multiple purposes. It was a visible mark of mourning, announcing to the community that the family had suffered a loss. It was a form of sacrifice, a physical alteration that demonstrated the family's grief. And it was temporary but long-lasting. Eyebrows take weeks to grow back, meaning the family would carry this mark of their loss for an extended period. The body of the deceased cat would be treated with the same respect afforded to human corpses. It would be wrapped in linen, often high-quality linen that poor families might struggle to afford. It would be anointed with cedar oil and other preservatives. Depending on the family's wealth and the period in question, the cat might be placed in a decorated coffin, ranging from simple wooden boxes to elaborately carved and painted sarcophagi shaped like cats themselves. Some of these cat coffins are works of extraordinary artistry, with inlaid eyes of glass or stone, detailed hieroglyphic inscriptions and sophisticated joinery. Most importantly, the cat needed to be buried properly. For those who could afford it, this meant a pilgrimage to Bubastis, where the cat would be interred in one of the sacred cat cemeteries maintained by Bastet's temple. For those who couldn't make that journey, local cemeteries dedicated to animals sufficed. But the cat had to be buried in a sanctified place. Leaving a cat's body to decompose or disposing of it carelessly was unthinkable. These burial practices weren't limited to pampered pets of the wealthy. Archaeological excavations have found cat cemeteries throughout Egypt, in major cities and small villages alike. The cats buried in these places range from expensive mummified specimens with elaborate coffins to simpler burials, where the cat was wrapped in reeds or old linens. But even the simplest burial represents an investment of resources, time and care. Someone had to prepare the body, find or create wrappings, dig a grave, and perform whatever rituals their means allowed. In daily life, cats moved through Egyptian society with remarkable freedom. Tomb paintings show cats in all kinds of contexts, sitting under chairs during banquets, prowling through gardens, hunting birds in the marshes alongside human hunters, sleeping on beds, playing with children. These images are naturalistic. The artists clearly observed cats closely and depicted them accurately. The cats in these paintings look much like modern domestic cats in build and behaviour. They're shown in mid-stretch, mid-yawn, mid-groom, all the familiar poses any cat owner would recognise. One particularly charming image from the tomb of Nebamun, an 18th dynasty official, shows a cat that accompanied its owner on a fowling expedition. The cat has caught 3 birds simultaneously, one in its mouth, one under a paw, one clutched against its body. The image is both humorous and revealing. It shows the cat as an active participant in human activities, not just a passive presence. It also shows the kind of intimate observation that only comes from living closely with animals and finding them worthy of careful depiction. Cats appear in Egyptian literature as well, though less frequently than in visual art. The occasional hieratic text mentions cats by name. A Middle Kingdom papyrus refers to a cat named Tamut, the female cat, which might be either a personal name or a generic term. Some texts describe cats' hunting prowess in almost mystical terms, emphasizing their speed and precision. A few pieces of late-period wisdom literature use cats as moral examples, often contrasting their independence with dogs' servility, neither judgment entirely positive in Egyptian ethical thought, which valued loyalty but also self-sufficiency. The most telling evidence of cats' daily presence comes not from grand monuments or religious texts, but from the small, humble objects of everyday life. Cat-shaped amulets were worn by women hoping for fertility, the number of kittens on the amulet corresponding to the number of children desired. Cat figurines were placed in homes as protective charms. Children's toys included cat-shaped rattles and carved wooden cats on wheels. These objects appear across all social classes, from expensive bronze and faience pieces to crude clay sculptures. They tell us that cats were woven into the fabric of daily existence, present in Egyptian homes and hearts. The relationship between Egyptians and their cats was, by all evidence, affectionate. This might seem obvious today, when billions of humans share their homes with cats and dogs and feel genuine emotional bonds with them. But in the ancient world, this was less common. Many civilizations kept animals for specific purposes: food, labour, protection, sacrifice. The emotional bond between human and animal was less emphasized or even seen as inappropriate. Egypt was different. Egyptians didn't just use cats, they loved them. This love was reciprocated in the way cat love always is, selectively, unpredictably, but genuinely. Cats chose to stay with humans. They could have left at any time, reverting to their wild ancestors' solitary existence. The fact that they stayed, generation after generation, suggests they found something valuable in human company. Food and shelter, certainly, but perhaps also something more difficult to quantify. The pleasure of sun-warmed laps, the satisfaction of purring together, the strange companionship between two species that chose to share space and occasionally affection. But Egyptian cat culture wasn't all gentle domesticity. It was also big business, and that business centred on death. Once a year, something extraordinary happened in Egypt. Something that blended religious devotion, social celebration, economic opportunity, and uninhibited joy into one massive, chaotic, unforgettable festival. This was the Feast of Bastet, held annually at Bubastis, and by all contemporary accounts, it was the single most popular celebration in all of Egypt. Understanding this festival is crucial to understanding Egyptian cat culture, because the festival reveals something essential. Egyptians didn't worship cats with solemn reverence alone. They celebrated them with unrestrained happiness. Our most detailed account of the festival comes from Herodotus, who visited Egypt around 450 BCE. His description is vivid, detailed, and just scandalous enough to have ensured its survival through centuries of copying and translation. Herodotus begins by noting that Egyptians held many festivals throughout the year, each dedicated to different gods, but the festival at Bubastis was by far the most popular and joyous. He estimated that as many as 700,000 people attended, a staggering number even allowing for ancient historians' tendency toward exaggeration. The journey to Bubastis was itself part of the celebration. Pilgrims travelled primarily by boat, the most practical means of transportation, in a land where the Nile was the primary highway. But these weren't solemn religious processions of quiet prayer and contemplation. These were floating parties. Boats of all sizes crowded the Nile during the festival season, packed with men and women, whole families, groups of friends, all making their way to Bubastis. Herodotus describes the scene with obvious fascination. The boats carried musicians who played flutes, drums, and sistrums, the sacred rattles associated with Bastet, continuously. Women sang and danced aboard the vessels. Some women wore rattles and shook them rhythmically, creating a constant percussion that must have echoed across the water. The celebration started the moment boats departed their home cities and continued without pause for the entire journey, which could take days depending on where travellers originated. But here's where Herodotus's account becomes particularly interesting. He notes that when these festival boats passed towns and cities along the riverbank, specific things happened. The women on the boats would call out to the women in the towns, shouting what Herodotus discreetly calls abuse or mockery. Modern scholars debate what exactly this entailed, probably loud, bawdy jokes, sexual innuendo, perhaps ritual insults similar to those found in other ancient festivals. The point was to provoke and entertain, to break down normal social boundaries. And then, some women would do something even more shocking to Greek sensibilities. They would pull up their garments and expose themselves to the people watching from shore. Herodotus, writing for a Greek audience to whom such public nudity was profoundly inappropriate, especially for respectable women, seems almost flustered in his description. He's careful to note that this happened at every city they passed, emphasising that this wasn't isolated outrageous behaviour, but an accepted part of the festival. Modern historians and anthropologists have offered various interpretations of this behaviour. The exposure was likely ritualistic rather than purely provocative, connected to fertility rites and the breaking of normal social restrictions during sacred time. Many ancient cultures had festivals where normal rules were suspended, where social hierarchies were temporarily inverted, where behaviour that would be scandalous in everyday life became acceptable and even required. These festivals served as pressure valves, allowing people to temporarily step outside the rigid structures of their societies. The Festival of Bastet had strong fertility associations. Bastet was, among other things, a goddess of childbirth and protection of children. Her nurturing aspect was central to her worship. The ritual nudity, the loud sexual humour, the unrestrained behaviour, all of these were likely connected to celebrating and encouraging fertility, both human and agricultural. Upon finally reaching Bubastis, the real celebration began. The pilgrims would disembark and make their way through the crowded streets to Bastet's temple. The temple complex occupied an island formed by canals branching off from the Nile, accessible via bridges and causeways. Trees lined these approaches, providing shade from the fierce Egyptian sun. The temple itself was magnificent, built and rebuilt over centuries by successive pharaohs, particularly during the 22nd dynasty, when Bubastis was at the height of its power. Inside the temple complex, the pilgrims would make offerings to Bastet. They might purchase a cat mummy to leave at the temple, a practice we'll explore more thoroughly shortly. They might buy small bronze or faience statues of the goddess. They might simply offer prayers, food, or incense. The scale of these offerings was enormous. Archaeological excavations have found vast deposits of votive objects buried in trenches around the temple grounds. Thousands upon thousands of statues, amulets, and cat mummies accumulated over centuries of worship. But the festival wasn't primarily about solemn religious observance. It was about celebration. Herodotus emphasises that more wine was consumed during the Festival of Bastet than during the entire rest of the year. This is obvious hyperbole, but it makes the point. This was a drinking festival on an almost unimaginable scale. The Egyptians, normally moderate drinkers by ancient standards, apparently cut loose completely during Bastet's festival. This makes theological sense. Bastet wasn't a stern, judgmental deity. She was a goddess of joy, of pleasure, of the good things in life. Her festivals naturally incorporated celebration, music, dance, and yes, alcohol. Ancient Egyptian religious texts actually prescribed drunkenness as appropriate for certain goddess festivals, referring to feasts of drunkenness intended to pacify and please fierce feminine deities. The idea was that making the goddess happy through joyful celebration would secure her continued protection and blessing. The music at the festival would have been continuous and overwhelming. Egyptian music featured flutes, harps, drums, and cymbals, but the signature sound of Bastet worship was the sistrum, a metal rattle that produced a distinctive shimmering sound when shaken. Sistrums were specifically associated with goddess worship, particularly of Hathor and Bastet. Images of the goddess often show her holding a sistrum, and priestesses of Bastet would shake these instruments during rituals. At the festival, thousands of pilgrims would have sistrums, creating a wall of sound that must have been both beautiful and slightly hypnotic. Dancing was central to the celebration. Egyptian dance could be both elegant and ecstatic, ranging from formalized ritual movements to wild, unrestrained physical expression. Bastet was specifically associated with dance and music, and her festivals would feature both professional temple dancers and ordinary pilgrims dancing in the streets and temple courtyards. The festival served multiple social functions beyond pure religious observance. It was an enormous market. with vendors selling food, drink, religious objects, and souvenirs to hundreds of thousands of visitors. It was a social gathering where people from across Egypt could meet, trade news, make business deals, and socialize across regional and class boundaries. It was a break from normal life, a liminal time when usual rules and hierarchies were suspended. For the city of Bubastis itself, the festival was an economic bonanza. The temple would collect donations and offerings. Local merchants would make significant income. The entire region would benefit from the influx of visitors. This economic dimension shouldn't be underestimated. Temples in ancient Egypt were major economic institutions, and a popular cult like Bastet's generated enormous wealth. But perhaps most importantly, the festival reinforced and renewed the connection between the people and their goddess. In a culture where religion permeated every aspect of life, where the gods were believed to actively involve themselves in human affairs, maintaining good relationships with deities was literally a matter of life and death. The festival allowed hundreds of thousands of people to simultaneously worship Bastet, to seek her favour, to celebrate her gifts, and to remind her of their devotion. The fact that this took the form of joyful celebration rather than solemn ceremony tells us something crucial about Bastet, and about Egyptian spirituality more broadly. The divine wasn't only approached through fear and awe, it could also be approached through joy, through pleasure, through the celebration of life's good things. Bastet represented the divine in its most accessible, most friendly aspect. She was still powerful, still capable of terrible wrath if angered, but she was also genuinely loving toward her devotees. The festival continued for days. Eventually exhausted and probably badly hungover, the pilgrims would make their way back to their boats and begin the journey home. The return journey was likely quieter than the trip to Bubastis, though probably still accompanied by music and celebration. Pilgrims would carry home their blessed amulets and mementos, their memories of the great celebration, and their renewed sense of connection to the goddess and her sacred animals. Year after year, for more than a millennium, this festival drew massive crowds. It survived political upheavals, foreign conquests, changes in dynasty and religion. Even as Christianity began to spread in Egypt, the Festival of Bastet continued, though probably with diminishing participation. It wasn't until the 4th century CE, when Roman emperors issued decrees explicitly banning pagan festivals, that the annual pilgrimage to Bubastis finally ended. But in its heyday, this festival was more than just a religious celebration. It was a massive expression of Egyptian identity, centered on a goddess whose sacred animal walked through every Egyptian home and city. It was a reminder that the divine wasn't distant but present, not fearsome but loving, not demanding but giving. And it was, by all accounts, one hell of a party. If you had walked the streets of Bubastis in the 6th century BCE, you might have noticed something peculiar about the cats. There were thousands of them, far more than you'd expect even in a city whose patron goddess was feline. They populated the temple complex naturally, but they also filled the streets, the markets, the residential areas. They were fed by temple staff and city residents. They were treated with reverence, and most of them were quite young. This wasn't coincidence. This was industry. Ancient Egypt developed what might be history's first large-scale animal breeding program, and it was dedicated to producing one product: cat mummies. The practice of mummifying cats began modestly. The earliest confirmed cat mummy dates to around 350 BCE, an elaborately carved limestone sarcophagus containing the beloved pet of Prince Thutmose. This was personal, a royal family mourning a cherished companion and ensuring its eternal preservation. For several centuries, cat mummification remained primarily the practice of wealthy individuals burying their pets. But during the late period of Egyptian history, roughly from 664 BCE onward, something changed. Cat mummification exploded in scale, transforming from an elite practice to a massive religious industry. The catalyst was the growing popularity of votive mummification. pilgrims visiting temples began purchasing animal mummies, not to bury their own pets, but to offer to the gods. The animal mummy served as a permanent prayer, a physical representation of the pilgrim's devotion that would remain in the temple forever, or at least until the priest buried it to make room for more offerings. The concept made theological sense. If you wanted to petition Bastet, what better offering than a cat, her sacred animal and living representative? The mummified cat would carry your prayer to the goddess, acting as an intermediary between the mortal and divine realms. This practice became so popular that temples couldn't possibly rely on naturally deceased cats. The demand was far too great. And so, Egyptian temples began breeding cats specifically for ritual sacrifice and mummification. Modern archaeologists and historians are careful to note that this wasn't necessarily cruelty in the ancient Egyptian mindset. These cats weren't being killed for trivial reasons or through neglect. They were being killed for sacred purposes to serve as divine offerings. Their deaths were quick, their bodies were treated with great respect, and they were believed to transition directly into an eternal afterlife in the presence of the goddess. By ancient standards, this was arguably better treatment than most animals received in the ancient world, where creatures were routinely worked to death, sacrificed in numbers, or simply slaughtered for food with no ceremony whatsoever. That said, the scale was staggering. Archaeological estimates suggest that at least 70 million animal mummies were created in Egypt during the roughly 1,000 years when votive mummification was popular. Not all of these were cats. Birds, particularly ibises and falcons, were also mummified in enormous numbers, along with dogs, crocodiles, snakes, and various other creatures. But cats were among the most popular subjects, and the numbers boggle the mind. In 1888, an excavation at Beni Hassan in central Egypt uncovered a cat cemetery containing approximately 80,000 mummified cats. In the 1890s, another site yielded more than 200,000 cat mummies in a single mass grave. Edouard Neville, excavating at Bubastis in the late 1880s, found pits filled with cat bones measuring up to 720 cubic feet in volume. Even accounting for some of these numbers being estimates or exaggerations, we're still talking about millions of cats. The mummification process itself was sophisticated. For valuable mummies, the process closely resembled human mummification. The body would be eviscerated, treated with natron, a naturally occurring mixture of sodium carbonate and sodium bicarbonate, to dry it out, anointed with oils and resins, wrapped in multiple layers of linen and placed in a decorative container. Some cat mummies were wrapped to show the animal's features, with linen strips carefully arranged to create a recognizable cat shape, sometimes with painted details to indicate eyes, ears, and whiskers. The highest quality cat mummies are remarkable works of art. The wrappings form geometric patterns. The coffins, whether wooden or ceramic, are beautifully crafted. Some bronze cat coffins feature intricate designs, with cats shown sitting regally or lying in repose. Amulets and charms might be included in the wrappings. Hieroglyphic inscriptions invoke Bastet's protection. These objects were expensive, accessible only to wealthy pilgrims, or those who'd saved for years to afford a premium offering. But not all cat mummies were so elaborate. Cheaper versions used less expensive wrapping, simpler preservation techniques, and basic containers. The sheer scale of demand meant that temple workshops had to operate with something approaching industrial efficiency. Recent CT scans and X-rays of ancient cat mummies have revealed that not all of them contain what you'd expect. In 2011, researchers at the University of Manchester conducted a comprehensive study using modern medical imaging to scan hundreds of animal mummies. The results were surprising. Only about 2/3 of the cat mummies contained complete cat skeletons. The rest contained partial remains, a skull, some leg bones, a few vertebrae, or in some cases, no cat remains at all, just linen wrappings around fillers like mud, sticks, or pebbles. Were these fakes intended to defraud pious pilgrims? Probably not, or at least not usually. The researchers believe that even partial remains were considered acceptable offerings. In Egyptian religious thought, a part could represent the whole. A single cat bone wrapped properly and offered with sincere devotion might be as effective as a complete mummy. Moreover, pilgrims probably understood, or at least suspected, that not every mummy contained a complete specimen. The religious efficacy lay in the ritual of offering, not necessarily in the completeness of the physical object. Nevertheless, the incomplete mummies do suggest that demand occasionally outstripped supply. Even with dedicated breeding programs, temples couldn't always produce enough cats to meet festival season demand. In these cases, temple staff made do with what they had, supplementing genuine cat remains with other materials to create the appropriately cat-shaped packages that pilgrims expected. The breeding operations necessary to supply this industry were substantial. Temple complexes maintained catteries, areas dedicated to housing and breeding cats. Dedicated staff fed, cared for and managed these cat colonies. Archaeological evidence suggests thousands of cats lived at major cult centres like Bubastis and Saqqara. The infrastructure required, including housing, feeding, healthcare and waste management, would have been considerable. Radiographic examination of mummified cats reveals uncomfortable details about how they died. Many show signs of skull fractures or dislocated neck vertebrae, indicating they were killed by blows to the head or by having their necks broken. These were quick deaths, but they were deliberate killings. Most of the mummified cats were young, even kittens, probably because younger animals were easier to manage and their smaller size made them more economical to mummify and transport. The economic scale of cat mummification was enormous. Consider the supply chain. Breeding operations required food for thousands of cats. Mummification required linen, much of it probably recycled but still requiring collection, cleaning and distribution. Natron for preservation, oils and resins for anointing, wood or ceramic for coffins, labour for the actual mummification process, and transport for finished mummies. Administrative overhead was necessary to manage workers, track inventory, and maintain quality control. All of this cost money, and all of it had to be paid for by the temples, either from their own resources or from the proceeds of selling mummies to pilgrims. Temples in late-period Egypt were supposed to be financially self-sustaining. Pharaonic subsidies were limited or non-existent. Temples had to generate their own income through offerings, land holdings, and commercial activities. For temples dedicated to popular deities like Bastet, selling mummies was a significant revenue source. It estimated that the Bubastis temple alone handled hundreds of thousands of votive mummies over the centuries, each one sold to a pilgrim at a profit. Some temples became famous for particular animals. Saqqara was known for ibis mummies. Bubastis was, naturally, the premier source for cat mummies. A temple's reputation for quality, for particularly powerful offerings, could attract pilgrims from across Egypt and beyond. Competition between temples for pilgrim spending probably drove innovation in mummy production and marketing. The cat mummy industry also supported ancillary businesses. Workshops produced coffins and wrappings. Merchants transported finished mummies. Artists created the painted and sculpted decorations. Scribes wrote the hieroglyphic dedications. This created employment and contributed to local economies, particularly in cities like Bubastis that were major pilgrimage destinations. When temples ran out of storage space for accumulated offerings, priests would dig special trenches or catacombs and bury masses of mummies together. These weren't individual graves, they were deposit sites, sacred storage for offerings that had served their purpose. Some of these deposits are vast. The Bubastium at Saqqara contained a catacomb network that held millions of animal mummies. At Bubastis itself, the cat cemeteries extended over acres. In the 19th century, when European archaeologists began excavating these sites, they found cat mummies in almost unbelievable quantities. Some excavators, not understanding their religious significance and seeing only commercial potential, shipped thousands of cat mummies back to Europe. In one infamous case, a cargo of nearly 200,000 cat mummies arrived in Liverpool, England, where they were ground up and sold as fertilizer. The calcium from the bones and the organic matter from the linen made decent agricultural fertilizer, but the cultural loss was incalculable. Fortunately, not all cat mummies met such an ignoble fate. Many were purchased by museums and collectors who recognised their historical value. Today, cat mummies are housed in museums worldwide, from the British Museum to the Smithsonian to Cairo's Egyptian Museum. They remain objects of fascination, beautiful in their craftsmanship and haunting in their implications. The end of the cat mummy industry came gradually. As Christianity spread in Egypt from the 1st century CE onward, traditional Egyptian religion declined. Roman emperors issued increasingly restrictive edicts against pagan practices. By the 4th century CE, animal sacrifice and the creation of votive mummies were explicitly banned. Temples were closed, their properties confiscated, their priesthoods disbanded. The last cat mummies date to the early centuries of the Common Era, produced by communities still clinging to the old ways in increasingly hostile times. The industry that had sustained Bubastis for a millennium vanished. The catteries emptied. The mummification workshops closed. The sacred cemeteries were abandoned. Their millions of cat mummies left to wait in darkness for modern archaeologists to disturb their rest. But the mummies themselves survived, preserved by the very techniques that were meant to ensure their eternal nature. And in surviving, they tell us about a civilization that saw the divine in animals, that built an industry around sacred offerings, and that valued cats so highly it was willing to breed, kill, and mummify them by the millions, all in the hope of gaining divine favour. The rediscovery of ancient Egypt's cat culture began, like so much Egyptology, with Napoleon. When French forces invaded Egypt in 1798, Napoleon brought with him a cadre of scientists and scholars, the Commission des Sciences et des Arts. These men wandered the Egyptian landscape, sketching ruins, copying inscriptions, collecting artefacts. Among their findings were the first documented cat mummies seen by Europeans in modern times. In Lycopolis near Asyut and in the Theban necropolis, they found mummified cats and other animals, objects that fascinated the French scholars even if they didn't fully understand their significance. In the early decades of the 19th century, European interest in Egypt intensified. Collectors and museums sought Egyptian antiquities with fervour bordering on mania. The Louvre began exhibiting cat statues in the 1820s, beautiful objects of wood, bronze and enamelled pottery, mostly from Bubastis. These weren't scientific excavations by modern standards, they were treasure hunts, with artefacts removed from their archaeological context and shipped to European collections. Christian Gottfried Ehrenberg, a German naturalist who visited Egypt in 1830, made careful observations of Egyptian cats. He documented 3 distinct types of small cats: the jungle cat, the African wildcat, and what he called a sacred cat intermediate between the two. He named this Felis Bubastis, recognising the connection to the city of the cat goddess, though his classification wouldn't survive modern taxonomic scrutiny. The Egypt Exploration Society funded the first major scientific excavation of Bubastis in the late 1880s. Swiss Egyptologist Edouard-Henri Naville led the work. The scale of what they found was stunning. The cat cemetery alone contained pits filled with cat and mongoose bones totalling hundreds of cubic metres. Among the bones were embalming materials, bronze objects, beads, ornaments, and statues of Bastet and Nefertem. By 1889, Naville's team had, in their own estimation, exhausted the cemetery, though later excavations would prove there was more to find. The sheer quantity of cat remains presented a problem. What to do with them? To Victorian archaeologists, cat mummies weren't particularly valuable. They wanted gold, monumental sculpture, royal artefacts, things that would impress museum donors and attract public attention. Animal mummies were curiosities at best, nuisances at worst. Many were simply left behind or, as we've noted, sold off as fertilizer. Yet some scholars recognised their value. By the late 19th century, the emerging science of Egyptology was beginning to understand that even humble artifacts could reveal important information about ancient cultures. Cat mummies told stories about religious practices, economic systems, even animal husbandry. A few forward-thinking archaeologists and museum curators began systematically collecting and cataloguing animal mummies. Throughout the 20th century, understanding of Egyptian cats deepened. Archaeologists excavating temples found depictions of cats in contexts that revealed their social and religious roles. Papyri occasionally mentioned cats by name or described their treatment. Most importantly, the development of new technologies allowed scientists to study mummies without destroying them. X-rays could reveal what was inside wrappings without unwrapping them, preserving the mummies while satisfying curiosity about their contents. This technology revealed that many cat mummies were incomplete, or contained no animal remains at all, leading to important insights about ancient Egyptian religious economics and the challenges of maintaining industrial-scale mummification. In the 21st century, CT scanning and DNA analysis have revolutionized our understanding of ancient Egyptian cats. In 2008, archaeozoologist Wim van Neer excavated Hierakonpolis and found those 6 cats, the ones whose healed fractures suggested early captivity and taming. In 2017, an international team published a comprehensive DNA analysis of more than 200 ancient cats, tracing the genetic lines that led to modern domestic cats. This study revealed that Egyptian cats represent a distinct lineage of the African wildcat, and that this Egyptian line spread globally, becoming the ancestors of most modern house cats. More recent studies, including 2025 research from European universities, have suggested that Egyptian ritual sacrifice might have accelerated cat domestication. The theory is that breeding large numbers of cats in close quarters for temple use would have selected for more docile, human-tolerant individuals. Over time, this could have created a population of cats that were friendlier and more suited to domestic life than their wild ancestors. While controversial, this theory highlights how religious practices might have inadvertently shaped genetic evolution. Modern archaeology continues to uncover new information about Egyptian cats. In 2018, excavations near Cairo revealed a tomb containing dozens of cat statues and mummified cats, some elaborately wrapped and decorated. In 2020, work at Saqqara uncovered previously unknown catacombs containing hundreds more animal mummies. Each new discovery adds detail to our understanding of how comprehensively cats were integrated into Egyptian civilization. Museum collections worldwide house hundreds of thousands of Egyptian cat-related artifacts. The British Museum's Egyptian collection includes numerous cat mummies, statues of Bastet, and cat-shaped amulets and coffins. The Smithsonian, the Louvre, the Cairo Museum, countless other institutions preserve pieces of Egypt's feline heritage. These aren't just dead relics, they're primary sources, objects that scholars can study to understand ancient Egyptian culture. The legacy of Egyptian cats extends beyond archaeological sites and museum displays. The Egyptian Mau, a spotted cat breed developed in the mid-20th century, is believed to be descended from cats that lived in ancient Egypt, though the genetic evidence is complex and debated. The Mau's characteristic spots and large expressive eyes do resemble cats depicted in ancient Egyptian art. Whether or not the breed is truly ancient, it serves as a living link to the cats that once roamed Bubastis and Thebes. More broadly, the entire concept of cats as domestic companions, as animals worthy of affection and special treatment, can be traced back to Egypt. Other ancient cultures kept animals, but Egypt's relationship with cats was unique in its emotional depth and religious significance. When Egyptian cats spread across the Mediterranean world through trade and conquest, they brought with them the expectation that cats should be valued, protected, and treated as something special. The Roman Empire adopted Egyptian cats enthusiastically, using them for pest control and increasingly as pets. From Rome, cats spread throughout Europe, Later, European colonialism distributed cats globally. Today, there are an estimated 600 million to 1 billion domestic cats worldwide, living on every continent except Antarctica, the descendants of those Egyptian cats that first entered human settlements 6,000 years ago. Every cat sleeping in sunbeams, every cat purring on laps, every cat posting imperiously on furniture and demanding attention, carries within it the legacy of ancient Egypt. The ancient Egyptians didn't just domesticate cats, they created the cultural template for how humans relate to cats. They established the idea that cats are special, that they deserve protection and care, that they're worthy of love and even reverence. In a very real sense, ancient Egypt's cats are still ruling us, still shaping human behaviour through the expectations and attitudes the Egyptians established thousands of years ago. We think we own our cats. The Egyptians knew better. Cats, whether in ancient Bubastis or modern Brooklyn, belong to themselves. We merely share space with them, grateful when they choose to acknowledge us. In the grand sweep of ancient Egyptian history, from the first pharaohs to Cleopatra's suicide, a period spanning more than 3,000 years, one constant presence watched it all unfold. Cats. They witnessed the construction of the pyramids, the expansion of empire, the invasions and collapses, the Renaissance and decline. Through all of it, they maintained the same basic relationship with Egyptians, protected, revered, and fundamentally independent. What makes Egypt's cats remarkable isn't just that they were worshipped or protected or mummified by the millions. It's that they achieved this status through simply being themselves. Dogs had to be useful, obedient, trainable. Horses had to be strong and swift. Cattle had to provide meat, milk, and labour. But cats just had to exist. Their very nature, their grace, their mysterious independence, their dual capacity for gentleness and violence was enough to make them sacred. This tells us something profound about ancient Egyptian culture. The Egyptians were observers of the natural world with a sophistication we sometimes underestimate. They saw in animals not just resources but expressions of divine qualities. They understood that the universe was full of mysteries, and they didn't always try to solve them. Sometimes they simply revered them. The cat embodied mystery perfectly. You can never fully know what a cat's thinking. You can never fully predict what it will do. It offers affection on its own terms, never through compulsion. It serves household needs but isn't servile. It's simultaneously vulnerable, a small animal that can be hurt and dangerous, a predator that kills with efficient brutality. Living with cats teaches humility because cats will never bend themselves to human will the way dogs do. They remain, always, a little bit wild. The Egyptians understood this and, remarkably, they didn't try to change it. They didn't breed cats into compliance or train them into civility. They let cats be cats, and they revered them for it. In doing so, they created a relationship that has endured for millennia, one that continues today every time someone opens their home to a small, furry creature whose ancestors once walked the halls of pharaohs. If you enjoyed this journey through Egypt's feline past, please like this video and subscribe to History Somnia for more deep dives into the fascinating, forgotten corners of history. Let me know in the comments. Would you have attended the Festival of Bastet? Could you imagine living in a society where cats were legally more protected than most humans? And most importantly, do you think your own cat remembers its divine heritage? I suspect mine certainly does. Until next time, remember that every time your cat stares at you with those inscrutable eyes, it's channeling 3,000 years of silent rule.